record. Can you hear me now? I'm not muted, and sound appears to be, yeah, you can hear me? Y'all can hear? Okay, good. All right, make sure that your sound is turned up, because that may be the problem. At any rate, talking about the presidency and Congress, it's hard to talk about those things separately. You know, they're obviously connected, and they obviously have powers that, you know, separate chapters in the textbook and all that stuff's kind of artificial anyway. But these two elements are of government are interrelated and are dependent upon each other. But I don't want you to think that, you know, Congress can't act on its own, because they can have their own legislative agenda, and they don't require, they don't require the presidency in, they don't require the president to take action. I mean, if they can pass legislation without a presidential signature. They can create their own agenda. They can be completely different than the American presidency. They don't have to be in the same party, which you're about to experience, and they'll have their own agenda. And this Congress is no different, or the next Congress is no different. There'll be majority Republican in the House and in the Senate, and they will not further Mr. Biden's agenda. They'll have their own, and they may have the votes to pass it. And they're talking about doing things that will be quite radical and undoing years and years of precedent and years of programs and that sort of thing that Americans have depended upon. But if you have the votes, and this is paramount that you understand this, if you have the votes, you can do anything you want. And it'll take years for the Supreme Court to declare it unconstitutional, and this Supreme Court won't. Whatever that Republican agenda is, this Supreme Court will find constitutional grounds for it. Government's about to radically change. This country is about to radically change. It's fascinating that it doesn't seem to matter that you can tell Americans that these things are going to happen, because either they don't understand, or they don't believe you, or they're indifferent to it until it's their ox that gets gored. For years, it was the Republican agenda to overturn Roe v. Wade, and people either didn't believe it. In the 2016 election, it was evident that the next president was going to appoint people that were either going to uphold Roe or overturn Roe. And when Trump won, that was it. The end of constitutional rights, the end of women's ability to control their reproductive futures. And please do not believe that abortion is going to satisfy the Republicans. Their groups, including Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, who want to abolish constitutional protections under the grounds of a constitutional right to privacy, to eliminate birth control pills. You had to go to the Supreme Court to get a constitutional law to recognize the right to ingest birth control pills. Griswold versus Connecticut. The right for married couples to ingest birth control pills. And so now, here we are. And it would take a constitutional amendment to protect reproductive rights. And you're not going to get that. You're not going to get it because 3/4 of the state legislatures are Republican, and it takes 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify constitutional amendments. Congress has to propose them, and you're not going to have this new Congress that's about to get elected next week and take office in January. And by the way, the law says that they are to take office in January. But why wouldn't they just want to take office now? Why wouldn't they just want to take office Wednesday morning after getting elected Tuesday? So it'll be interesting to see. You are living through some very, very interesting, very fascinating times that will have repercussions for yourself. Hang on just a second. I got a dog at the door crying. Let me let her in. They behave better when they're let in. Hey, come on. Can you make it? Come on in. Okay. All right. So presidential power. Article 2, the second element of the Constitution, not Article 1. Article 1 for Congress, Article 2 for the president. Clearly the founders, not numbering accidentally, numbering this way on purpose. Clearly, they created the executive to be secondary to Congress. They created the executive to be secondary to Congress. And you will find presidential powers in Article 2, Section 2 and 3. Article 1 just talks about the qualifications for president. And really those qualifications are to be 35 years of age, which was considered middle age at the time, to be a native born American. That meant to be born here in the United States and not to be born abroad. And you would think that there wouldn't be any controversy about that, but there have been times when people thought they didn't meet the qualifications. And of course, that's a great rumor to start about someone and put them on the defensive about that, as candidate Trump or someone making noise about running said of Barack Obama. He was born in Hawaii. Hawaii became a state in 1960, and Obama was born in Hawaii in 61. He was an American. If a person is born on an American military base, or if an American, one parent is an American and a person is born abroad. Lee Harvey Oswald's older daughter, June, was born in Russia, but he was an American. And so she was an American citizen. And even though her mother was Russian and she was born in Russia, she's an American citizen. Of course, the Russians would claim dual citizenship. And some people do have dual citizenship. Some people have two passports. It depends on their circumstances. John McCain was born on an American base in Panama. His mom and dad were American citizens. He was born on an American base. That makes him an American. So it's really not as controversial as people make it out to be. But from time to time, there have been some silly questions about it. And then a president has to have been a resident of the United States for 14 years. And all of this was really designed to make sure that the president didn't have divided loyalties between the US and Great Britain. And so that evidently was a concern. It was also a way of keeping Alexander Hamilton from being president. They didn't like Hamilton much. And I suppose he suffered the problems that a lot of smart people do. People were jealous of him. He was pretty arrogant, but he was not born in a British colony. He wasn't born in these United States. He was born in Jamaica, and it wasn't a British territory, and wasn't a former British colony. Wasn't part of the original colonies, and so those provisions were really designed to kind of help keep Hamilton from being president. Not that Hamilton was entirely supportive of a presidency. He kind of made a strong case in the Federalist Papers for a king again. So at any rate, those were the limitations. Those were the qualifications. Notice how broad they are. Notice that it doesn't say anything about education. And a lot of the founders were schooled at home. And you didn't have formal education. You didn't have law schools. You didn't have law degrees. You had people who studied the law with law firms, but they themselves didn't go to law school. That came about much later. Some of these guys were educated at colleges and universities. And then, of course, there's Jefferson, who invents the University of Virginia, right down to the design of the buildings and the design of the curriculum. So education, though, wasn't a factor. Today, you're not easily going to elect somebody, if ever, again, that didn't have a college degree. Harry Truman did not have a college degree, but people did not think that Truman was not well educated. And then you have people who do have Ivy League educations and do poorly in the presidency. So it's not a matter of so much about these formal qualifications. I think it really boils down to character. Historians come out every now and then with these lists of best and worst presidents and that sort of thing. And all of that has to do with popularity and that kind of thing. But it's not necessarily based on qualifications at all. Presidential power, though, I'm going to break this down in a little easier way than to understand what the Constitution has to say about it. And I think it's easier to look at these descriptive kind of terms than to depend upon the way the Constitution discusses the presidency, because there are a lot of terms of art, or I should say, a lot of terms that don't have much meaning to you, just the way that they're written in the Constitution. So you should think about it this way. Talk about the president's military powers. And we've talked about this a little bit, and this is really fascinating because you are going to get into some foreign affairs issues and things that people worry about a lot, like, getting drafted and things like that. Section 2, Article 2, Section 2 says that the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. And what that means is the president can activate the National Guard. My dad was in the Texas National Guard, and he was called to active duty by President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy over Berlin and Cuba. And so Kennedy was commander-in-chief, Eisenhower commander-in-chief, but even though he was in the Texas National Guard, the president can activate those National Guards and then he controls them, okay? So think about the president's military powers, and the Constitution says nothing, of course, about um, the president's ability to use nuclear weapons, but that's the president's decision and not Congress's decision. And it's the president and another cabinet official. Ideally, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, that would say to the president, yes, I agree, nuclear weapons should be used. No, it actually takes two of them to launch it. And if somebody refused to help the president in that capacity, the president just would find somebody who would help them. And so if we're in that kind of situation, the National Security Council will be where the president is looking for that support. And the president pulls together that National Security Council that's made up of, key cabinet officials, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Finance, of the Treasury, and that's going to include the Joint Chiefs and other advisors that the president, vice president would see fit. Okay, so if we got into that conflict, and right now it's important to recognize that we are as close to nuclear weapons and an exchange of, or a possible nuclear scenario, as the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, finds himself bogged down in a controversial, unpopular war in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are giving him a much better fight than anyone anticipated. Part of that is because your better Russian troops are not there, are not being deployed there. But Ukraine is really able to defend herself a lot better. Plus, there's a lot of American money going into defending Ukraine. As former Secretary of State Clinton said this past weekend, she said, the Ukrainian fight is our fight. That they're fighting for democracy, and that's why we're on their side and fighting against a dictator like Vladimir Putin. It's in America's interest for Ukraine to prevail. Strategically, Ukraine's pretty important to us. They're at a huge naval base at on the Black Sea at Odessa, and the Russians want that port back. That's part of the reason for the conflict. Ukraine, without going into a big, huge history about this, Ukraine has been a disputed territory. It was one of the Soviet republics. It was a strategic launching point for Hitler into Russia during World War II. There's been times when Ukraine has been independent of Russia. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country again. They are the breadbasket of not only Russia, but much of the world now. Strategically, for food purposes, for military purposes, they're very important. So we'd like to see Ukraine remain independent. We'd like to see Russia stay in her lane and stop attacking a sovereign nation. But Putin's not doing very well there. And I fully well anticipate that there is a real possibility that he will be humiliated enough and backed into a corner enough, not only by Ukraine, but by ultra conservative elements in Russia too, that using nuclear weapons, small tactical nuclear weapons in the field, looks like a real alternative to continuing an unwise ground war in Ukraine. Ukraine is not part of NATO. They had asked to join NATO several years ago, and there was quite a bit of controversy about whether or not to do this. NATO is right on, and that stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was our response to the Warsaw Pact, to the Soviet um, sphere of influence after World War II. And NATO is, Great Britain, France. Well, France is no longer a member of NATO, but they might as well be. NATO is our response to an expansive Soviet Union and now an expansive Russia. But NATO cannot, as a member of NATO, the US cannot deploy troops into Ukraine. And you certainly don't want to do that, because you're going to find yourself fighting Russians, and that would be seen as, an encroachment on Russian foreign policy area, and you could get us into a nuclear war pretty quickly. And so we have to really be cautious about the aid we give. It can be seen as defensive aid and not offensive aid. And that concept gets to be really important to the US during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We are in Cuban Missile Crisis like proportions, like that kind of situation right now. This is perilous. It is a very serious situation. Should Putin deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it's going to demand an American response, demand a NATO response. Even though that's not a NATO ally, the repercussions of the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine means that you're going to have refugees pouring over Ukraine's borders into surrounding countries that are NATO members. And so we're going to have to deal with those refugees. Radiation doesn't know boundaries. And so you're going to have the possibility of radiation spreading all over Western Europe. And there will need to be a response to that. And you're going to see the deployment of more NATO troops to play catch, if you will, to deal with those refugees pouring over the border and securing American and NATO, American interest in NATO borders, NATO member borders across the area. And the problem with this is too, when you have all those millions of people pouring over borders to get away from radioactivity and to get away from the suffering and the repercussions of radioactive fallout, you don't know if everyone fleeing is indeed a refugee. It's an excellent opportunity for Russians to be pursuing an aggressive encroachment into NATO countries. And so you have to be very cautious about who's coming over those borders. And people don't wait around to have papers to use to flee, or passports to use to flee. Some folks don't have passports. So identifying those people, finding places for them to live, dealing with the health consequences, dealing with burns, dealing with the disposal of large numbers of dead people, should that weapon be of that size and nature. All of those are very dramatic problems that have to be dealt with, and we're the United States, and it'll be our job to deal with it. We also know more about cleaning up nuclear radiation and nuclear fallout and the unsanitary conditions that can be a result of that than any other nation, because we're the only nation who's used nuclear weapons in wartime, and we understand how awful that decision and that practical use of that weapon is. And so it's our responsibility to deal with it. And NATO, and we are NATO. Um, there's no way, around that. Okay? So this is something that we have to be intimately aware of, and are monitoring this situation. Of course, we have early warning awareness, and we watch with satellites, the satellite technology, for any indication of a possible nuclear strike, and a possible nuclear deployment. That's something that we can recognize with satellites, and of course, radiation badges and that kind of thing. I have a former student who's in Finland right now, and he texted me the other day that uh, they were unable to get any iodine pills. That all the pharmacies are all uh, sold out, and that they're very difficult to come by now. You know what the radiation pills are for, right? They want people to take them as tensions escalate, but under a doctor's prescription, follow the directions. Do you have some? Yeah. Um, I hadn't really thought about them, here. Um, I'm curious, if it got to that, Stephanie, I just don't know if the kind of weapon that would be deployed over um, the Houston Sugarland area uh, would sort of make those radiation pills a little, quaint. If we got into that situation, y'all are aware, aren't you, that Houston would be, if we got into a nuclear exchange, and I'm not talking about Ukraine, I'm talking about with the Russians, and over the deployment of a strike against the United States. Y'all are aware, aren't you, that Houston would be one of the first places that the Russians would attack with nuclear weapons, and the Russians' nuclear weapons, oil and gas, shipping, high technology, every earmark you can think of. Uh, the reason to attack, a place, Houston's it. I would say within the first four cities attacked, New York, California, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston. Um, and Washington D.C., of course. Um, so the kind of weaponry used in this area would be so incredibly radioactive. The Russians do not have as accurate weapons, so they make them dirtier. They fill them with more radiation. And so, any area within 50 miles of Houston, that would be considered a direct hit on Houston, and the radioactivity necessary to radiate Houston, even if you struck 50 miles outside, that's a pretty dirty bomb. It's a pretty huge payload of radioactive material. It would completely incinerate Houston. Um, and think about all the glass buildings downtown. You know what happens to them? That shatter, and the glass shards flying through the air. That molten glass and steel. Uh, there wouldn't be anything resembling a city left. It would just be pounded into nothing. And the kinds of weapons that were used over Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that uh, and people would not survive. And as it has been said before, the living would envy the dead. It would take about 2 weeks, if anyone survived, to die an absolute horrific death from radiation poisoning. And there wouldn't be anything to eat, and there wouldn't be anything to drink. And if you want to read a really good article about what would happen and what that would be like, um, when I was a college student, Carl Sagan wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine called Nuclear Winter. And it talked about what an exchange between the US and the USSR would be like. And what it would do is the fallout from that would be like snowflakes, about the size of great big snowflakes. And it would blot out the sun, creating a nuclear winter. And ironically, after all that fire, people would freeze to death if they survived, and it would blanket the northern hemisphere in fallout and darkness and radioactivity as wind currents would spread the radiation. And then eventually it would drift, of course, to the southern hemisphere and wipe out all life there. Um, I Let me see if I can pick up what you wrote there. Did get my innermost from start with water and canned food when the nuclear threat started a few months ago. Yeah, I know. I am well aware that there are people doing that in major cities, and like I said, my former student, he's in Finland right now. I have friends that live in Helsinki, and they're prepared for that. But the thing about all of this is that if people anticipate ever going outside of their homes again, if their homes were to survive, I mean, all anybody has to do is take a look at yeah, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of course during our fears about this, after World War II, through my growing up. We had drills where you got under your desk, and those kinds of things are really quaint. But people built bomb shelters in their backyard, and every now and then you hear about a house going up for sale that had a bunker in the backyard. You could buy them in catalogs. You could buy a bunker from Sears, and people dug holes in their backyards and put these bunkers in there. And there are Twilight Zone episodes about this kind of thing. The thing about it is, y'all, is that you'd never be able to come out of one of them. This radiation doesn't just disappear with the next rainstorm. It's not like that at all. I'll put it to you this way: there are people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima to this day that are born with birth defects as a result of exposure to radiation, to a device that was used in 1945. Chromosome damage, genetic mutation as a result of exposure to radiation. And so I cannot, it happened that people entertained notions of survival, but I can't really get my head around that, and what that would be like. If you really want to see a good Hollywood recreation of what it would all look like, I recommend to you that you watch a movie. It's probably on YouTube. A movie called The Day After, that was very controversial at the time. The Reagan administration did not want this movie televised. ABC did televise it. Some cities, television stations would not carry it on their ABC affiliates. When I was in Waco, the local ABC affiliate would not carry it, but you could get the ABC affiliate out of Dallas, and we watched it over at a professor's house on television. And it was extremely well made, and it'll give you a very good uh, example of what it would be like. Um, I also recommend to you that you take a good look at photographs from Nagasaki and Hiroshima that were taken by occupying U.S. forces, so that you would get an opportunity to take a look at that. When I was in high school, and I graduated from high school in 1980. And the United States Army had just released films that they made. You have to realize I was born 20 years after the end of World War II, almost 20 years after. Yeah. And so those films and pictures and that sort of thing were very controversial, and Americans didn't see them until much later. And people were horrified and did not know and did not really have a grasp or an understanding of what Nagasaki and Hiroshima looked like. Um, I'll put it two or three things that really stick with me about Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And by the way, those bombs today are the triggers for the bombs that we are capable of launching. What I mean by that is the weapons that we have today are tens of 20s of hundreds of times more powerful, uh, maybe immeasurably more powerful than what were deployed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The weapons, the blast at Hiroshima was 8:15 in the morning, so people were walking to work, and of course, all their watches immediately stopped. By the way, there'd be no electricity, nothing battery operated will work. There'll be no television, no radio, no internet, no electricity, because of the first element of the deployment is that it knocks out all of that. So car engines won't start, cars won't run, that kind of thing. The bomb would blow up above ground. It doesn't hit the ground. Okay. You deploy it in the air. Why? So that it spreads as far as possible. And today it would be all missile strikes, not bombs shoved out of airplanes. Our technology is such. Well, folks, look, a rocket that can blast to the moon is nothing more than an intercontinental ballistic missile that can be uh, deployed. I mean, that's the point of the space program to some degree. Was strapping a nuclear weapon on an intercontinental ballistic missile, and you're able to launch those missiles at each other without with alarming accuracy. The Russians didn't make it to the moon. They got better later with technology. Of course, the International Space Station and that kind of thing. But part of the reason is they're not very accurate at controlling their intercontinental ballistic missiles. So they settle for getting close. Close is good in nuclear war. But at Hiroshima, people that were walking to work simply disintegrated, and all that was left of them was their shadow burned into the concrete on the street. The pattern on their clothing burned into their skin. The river that runs through it boiled. So people who were burning jumped into a boiling river. The heat, the intensity, if you saw the flash, you were blind. It burns your retinas. And so think about the medical problems of a nuclear weapon. Think about what that means. You don't have enough burn beds. There are not enough hospitals. We can't handle a bad run of flu because we don't have enough burn beds. I mean, enough flu beds and enough illness beds. You don't have enough burn beds to handle the number of people burning, the number of people whose skin will be burned off their bones if they survived it. There's not enough. The the agony and the destruction of the infrastructure will truly overwhelm everything. I highly recommend too a movie called 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fear of, well, the reality that was the closest we have come to nuclear weapons. And the only reason we're here talking about it is because there was a Soviet submarine officer who refused to okay a launch of a nuclear device from a submarine off the coast of Cuba in the missile crisis. The Russians had the ability to deploy a nuclear missile from a submarine, and it takes 3 officers on a Russian sub to launch, and 2 of them were a go for it, but this third one said, "No, I don't think so. I don't want to do that, and we're going to turn this sub around and go home." And that's why the Russians did not launch any nuclear weapons at the United States. Had they launched, it would have been a total nuclear response, not directed toward Cuba, although that would have been part of it. But nuclear weapons would have been launched from the United States to the Soviet Union, and they take 30 minutes to hit their targets. Because they go over the curve of the earth. They don't go around. This isn't cartoons. They don't go the long distance. They go over the top, which is the shorter distance. And Russian missiles launched at the United States from Cuba take 6 minutes to reach their target. There's absolutely no way to warn people in Houston or Dallas of incoming nuclear weapons. And if you warned them, what good would it do you? We can't get out of here when there's a hurricane coming. People would panic. It would be a horrific situation. And warning. I mean, I just can't fathom that situation. There are a lot of good movies about nuclear conflict. Fail Safe is a very good old film about nuclear conflict that I believe came out in the Kennedy administration. 13 Days is a marvelous film. Kevin Costner and Bruce Greenwood, and I really strongly recommend it to you. It was made based on people's diaries and transcripts of meetings, and it's a very accurate look at the missile crisis and what happened there. But that power remains in the hands of the president. It is not a military decision to use those weapons. It's not a decision that rests with the military. It's a decision that rests with one person, and that's a tremendous amount of responsibility, and certainly something that is not a dead issue as we watch what Mr. Putin may unleash. The possibility is very real that he may use tactical battlefield sized nuclear weapons. And those would be smaller. They would be useful in terms of eliminating population and eliminating military opposition. The problem is that you could kill a lot of your own people, and that's certainly not desirable. It also means that you have to occupy with more troops. You would have to deploy more troops to secure the area because you're going to have millions of people fleeing and millions of people panicking. And the logistics of that kind of thing are a nightmare. The possibility of accidental nuclear conflict is very real, and the possibility of the rules of engagement if something does happen. It's very hard to pull back from that abyss once that conflict would begin. Okay. So it's a huge area of study, and one that graduate school classes talk about routinely. I really do strongly recommend that you kind of dive into it. Two very good books that I can recommend to you. One by my friend Richard Rhodes, who won the Pulitzer Prize, called "The Making of the Atomic Bomb." Let's see, where's my copy of Richard's book? Hang on. This is the book, and this is paperback, half price books, $7. Super great. He's not a historian. He's just an amazing writer, and this discusses the science and the politics in such an awesome, readable, important way. Just tremendous to study, and I just cannot recommend this strongly enough. It is not a boring book. Is it on Amazon? Absolutely. He's a hoot. He's a really good guy, and just very kind, very accessible. But this is eminently readable. A lot of historians were probably pretty envious of his gift, but I really, really strongly recommend it to you. And there's a follow-up to this book. Look up Richard Rhodes on Amazon, and there's a follow-up to this book about the decision to build the hydrogen bomb. I think that it's super good too. The other book, and I think you should put this right beside it. They belong next to each other on any serious student's shelf. There's a book by a fellow named Gar Alperovitz, and it's available on Amazon too. There are two books by him. One's called Atomic Diplomacy, and it's super great. The other one, gosh, of course, the title just floats right out of my head, but his name is Gar Alperovitz, and what he's writing about is his scholarship leads him to believe that the atomic bomb was not necessary in terms of the deployment against Japan, that it was done largely to keep the Russians in check, that it was a Cold War decision, that it was designed to keep the Russians not only from invading Japan, but to keep the Russians from aggressively pursuing their foreign policy in the Pacific. The Russians had thrown millions, 50 million people they lost in World War II. And largely because the Russian strategic, the Russian military approach has always been throw a lot of soldiers at the problem. They're not very good strategic fighters. And they just simply threw people at the invading Germans. 50 million dead. And they got, on into Germany. And when you murder 50 million people through, and you lose 50 million people in a war, you're going to want to show something for your effort. And so Eastern Europe's future was a Russian one. Hitler launched his attack against Russia from Eastern Europe. And so the Russians weren't going to let that happen again. Their history is a history of invasion. Napoleon, World War I, World War II. And so any aggression from the West is suspect for them. So they wanted to invade Japan. Russia and Japan had a long-standing hatred, and they wanted to help the United States in Japan because they hated the Japanese and they wanted the Sakhalin Islands for their own purposes. And so they were poised to invade. And Truman used weapons in Japan, nuclear weapons in Japan. And so invasion of Japan by two fighting armies, the Soviets and the Americans, wasn't necessary. And so did that sort of curtail Russian designs on the post-World War world? Yeah, maybe. Maybe it was more to it than that. But looking at those two books really informs much more about the politics surrounding the use of nuclear weapons, the whole construction of nuclear weapons. Any questions about any of that or comments about any of that? I think it's difficult for students. You don't grow up with that fear of nuclear weapons like my generation did. And so I think even asking questions about any of this is hard because it's hard to get your head around a decision that can kill everybody on this planet that fast with a phone call. And I think that students don't really realize the import of that. It's just hard to grasp. It's just hard to understand, you know. But that's why I want to encourage you to read these good books and to encourage you to watch these films that help you conceptualize the unthinkable, helps you think about the unthinkable, um, and the import of that. Okay. Questions? Comments? Okay. Why don't we quit for the day? Let's pick up again next week when we're talking about presidential power. Please review Article 2, Section 2 and 3 of Article 2 in the Constitution so that you can look at presidential powers. And there are a couple of ways really to label them differently, like label military power. Don't just say commander in chief. You know, what does that mean? Well, military power. Well, what does that mean? You know, his legislative power, the president's judicial power, you know, the president's economic power. Do you think there would be any weapons worse than nuclear weapons? Well, yeah, they're hydrogen bombs, and those are worse. And there are neutron bombs, which leave the buildings but destroy the people. They leave the infrastructure. They don't just, you know, don't knock down buildings, don't melt bridges, but they kill people. Militarily, you need those buildings and you need those bridges, and you want there to be less people to deal with. And so that's why they're deployed. There are weapon systems now that are in development that, frankly, the science is, you know, sort of beyond me. But there are weapons that can eradicate large numbers of people or render them unable to protect themselves or unable to be aggressive. And so, will there ever be weapons worse than that atomic or nuclear or hydrogen or, you know, any of those class of weapons? That's a very, very good question. And I can assure you that weapons developers think along those lines every day. That every country wants some kind of super device that gives them a kind of military and psychological superiority that really serves to have the politics of terror, if you will, And it's all about control, and it's all about military superiority. And people sit around and think about this stuff all the time. Governments sit around and think about this stuff all the time. Putin has bragged that he has a supersonic, speedy delivery system that can get weapons here faster than 30 minutes. 30 minutes, has a big psychological threshold to it. But a weapon that uh, can travel, much like cruise weapons, that go along with the topography of the Earth, that can travel at lower levels faster than being launched into space. And you're probably aware, Mr. Mitchell, that we attempted to build shield systems, nicknamed Star Wars, but a strategic defense initiative concept where you deployed weapons in space, lasers in space that would shoot down nuclear missiles before they could re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. But think about it this way, y'all. That would be sort of like two bullets hitting each other. Uh, that that's difficult to, two bullets traveling at each other like that. That's kind of hard for us to fathom. And it sounds great in a laboratory, but I'm not sure about the practical application and use and success rate of that kind of thing. Heat-seeking missiles, of course, hit each other. And knock at each. We see that with airplanes, right? You see missiles that seek the heat signature and take out aircraft, and that it's the same sort of principle as that. But I want you to realize that they don't do this politely and launch one weapon at a time and let people shoot that down. You're talking about thousands of nuclear warheads deployed all at once to any city with over 25,000 people in it is a nuclear target. So the psychological warfare about all of this have to be considered too. But it's interesting. Do they have to make a big mess with a weapon in order for it to be an effective weapon? What about the so-called Havana syndrome now, where sound waves or other destructive wave forces can be directed at people and they lose their hearing, they lose their equilibrium, they lose their balance, they have vertigo, horrific vomiting, sometimes diarrhea. In other words, you make a population very sick by directing sound or concussive waves at them. And so just the high pitched or supersonic sound, subsonic sound, so that people, their eardrums rupture. There are all kinds of awful ways to terrorize populations. And weapons development is certainly a concept that people do study in public policy, and the possibility of these kinds of developments. So it's hard to imagine the unimaginable, but it's something that people do study and do spend time with. Other questions, other comments? Next week, okay, let's continue to talk about the presidency and talk about the powers of the presidency. And foreign policy, obviously, is important to talk about too. Domestic policy, economic policy, foreign policy. And so we'll deal with those issues next week. All right. Talk to y'all later. Take care now. No bad dreams just because we talked about this stuff. Okay. All right. Bye.